Hey there, guys. Alright, today we are back with some more potential history. Potential history. This time, the Kriegsmarine. Unsupported and left to die. Now, the last video we talked about... Right, the last video I watched was the one on the Sino-Japanese War, right? The Russian-Japanese War. I think it was on the Russian-Japanese War. I hope it was. Otherwise, I'm forgetful. So then this is back-to-back videos on, no, the last one was the best tank of World War II, wasn't it? Anyways, this time we're going back to the Navy. I still need to watch the Soviet tank meme, I know. We'll get to that eventually, but I want to watch videos on the Navy. So we're watching a video on the Kriegsmarine this time. Now, before I dive into this video, make sure you guys go ahead and check out the links in my description box or my pinned comment in the comment section. Got a link to my gaming channel here on YouTube and a link to my Twitch channel. Now, the Kriegsmarine, unsupported and left to die. Yeah, the Kriegsmarine was pretty much told to do these things. And then they were forgotten about and I didn't care about them, pretty much. Let's go ahead and hear what Potential History has to say.
No, but I've been told.
Is that Carl Donuts right there?
I've heard of these crackpots.
Intruders! This is our private stockpile for the
war.
So you got 3
Ships.
I did not think this one through.
This video is sponsored by Squarespace, the easy and reliable way to build a website for yourself or your business. Use my code POTENTIALHISTORY for 10% off your first Squarespace order, but more on that a little bit later. So this is a patron request video from Gerald Tan for being in my mouse tier on Patreon.
Make me that good shit.
And unlike most people who have a very specific video topic they want talked about, he left his broad, simply saying he wanted something on German battleships. As the Kriegsmarine and the Battle of the Atlantic isn't really my forte, it took me a second to come up with what the video should be about. But as I was finishing up video 2 of the Pacific series, yes, it's taken a while, my apologies, talking about how the Japanese were playing with battleships in the carrier war, I began to ask myself how Germany, with an even smaller navy, was even to take on and be what seems like a pretty big threat, at least as far as what I've heard, to the Royal Navy, with just a few battleships, some U-boats, and no carriers. This one doesn't count.
The Graf Zeppelin was never fully finished or used.
And what I found really surprised me, because it's all very different when you get down into it, and not quite what the sensationalized documentaries say it was.
God, I fucking hate History Channel so fucking much. During
World War I, the Kriegsmarine was limited
Although it wasn't yet called the Kriegsmarine. Good one, Johnny.
in manpower and technology, like the rest of the German military. But after the Nazis came to power, the restrictions were moved aside and ships began to be built, with the idea of a large high-seas fleet in mind. Germany knew that in the next war it would have to once again compete with the Royal Navy that defeated it in World War I, and the current biggest boat boy, Admiral Erich Raeder, laid out an all-encompassing plan in 1939 to accomplish this called
Plan Z!
Oh god.
It was approved by Hitler and assumed to reach its peak by 1948, as it would obviously take time and materials to put together this thing that would be able to rival the British Navy. However, Hitler started the war within a year, and the whole plan kind of went out the window. The grand German strategy was that of commerce raiding. That to strangle the British into submission, the Germans would have to cut off imports and essentially starve them out in a way. The problem was, when the war started, they didn't really have the necessary materials to do this, with their U-boats in the double digits and only a handful of real large ships, and about 20 or so destroyers, with at this point the French Navy to still consider. And with it being such a small force, I began to be kind of surprised at the disconnect between the fame the Kriegsmarine gets and the limited impact that it could possibly have with such a small force. In the Pacific series, I've been talking a lot about how aircraft carriers were the defining implement of the war, and that as Japan lost aircraft carriers, it was losing its power to wage the war. Germany throughout the war didn't have any carriers, on top of that had very few battleships and just ships in general, relying very heavily on their U-boats throughout, which did see a good bit of success through 1942. Now, this was the same sort of threat that the British faced in World War I, but found themselves having to adjust to it again in the Second World War. But it really didn't last. By May of 1943, the good times, as the Kriegsmarine called them, were over, and the Germans were regularly losing more U-boats than they were sinking merchant vessels. In the battleships
Yeah, and we saw this in, was it Eastery's video? In which she showed the goals of the German military, like the German Navy's goals to hit for the amount of tons of supplies sunk, and then what they were actually sinking. And then, of course, at one point they were getting close, and then the moment their shit got hacked or decoded, it went down.
had trouble as well, with Plan Z never really getting off the ground before material had to be shifted to land-based production heavily. The Germans only had a handful to work with. Sent to do commerce raiding as well, they were often sent out alone or in small numbers and were able to be tracked down by British air and sea power that was so overwhelming, not to mention the American air and sea power once they entered the war. The Admiral Graf Spee, for example, named after ya boy, was scuttled by her crew off the coast of South America when they thought they were outnumbered by British vessels due to some excellent deception tactics. The Bismarck, after sinking the Pride of the Royal Navy, was pummeled to death when it was left by itself in the Atlantic after its escort Prince Eugen was detached. Its sister ship, the Tirpitz, was unable to do much itself, as it was stuck in port for most of its life and eventually sunk by British bombers, although it took them a few tries. And the story for a lot of German ships really just kind of reads like that, some having more successful missions to their name than others. And don't get me wrong, the German Navy was a threat to British merchant shipping at the beginning of the war, and into the middle of it. And the Kriegsmarine, mostly the U-boats, sunk a lot of shipping, and it was a problem that had to be handled. But after reading account after account of different ships, I don't really understand the German naval strategy and how they executed it. It all seems like very much a sideshow to what was going on land, and was really not given the attention or the resources that it needed to carry out its mission. I mean, you obviously have—
Sounds like a common thread slash theme in the German war effort. Parts of the military not getting the resources that they need to wage their wars.
Something with some potential here. It's very clearly shown in the opening years of the war. But even as Admiral Dönitz takes command at the beginning of 1943 and the Kriegsmarine gets a better advocate from then on, U-boats are not being made at the rate they need to keep up with their losses. Never mind to build up the force they need to actually win the war. And as the British improve their technology and tactics to deal with them, the Kriegsmarine seems almost stagnant. And on top of that, you see ships like the Bismarck sent out virtually on their own to try to relieve some of the situation, pretty much damning it to be sunk. I almost feel for the Kriegsmarine commanders who had to be tearing their hair out to get the attention they needed for a very important aspect of the war, holding back the Western Allies, and simply not being able to.
Are we boned?
Yeah, we're boned.
Now, this is Germany that we're talking about, and there were shortages of everything, and who knows what building more ships or U-boats would have done to tank, aircraft, or small arms production. But these sailors are going out there trying to hold back what was pretty much an unstoppable force in the form of the Royal and US Navies, and at times would not even be able to replenish their own numbers. And it makes me wonder what the British would have thought in those early years where the U-boat menace was such a big deal, if they knew the kind of shoestring support they were getting from Hitler and the powers that be. And although a large part of the Kriegsmarine was out of the picture and really couldn't do much in the latter third of the war, what they were able to accomplish previously, and still able to accomplish in small numbers, is actually fairly impressive. Thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring.
I like how he, throughout this, that last note there on, they did not have the resources really to wage the war that they wanted on the seas. But with what they had available, they were able to do a fucking lot. And that's honestly another theme that we see with the German military, is that despite not having resources, they were still able to put up a fight. Like, even as the front lines shrank into Germany, German resistance was getting tougher and tougher, because now, you know, they, of course, were lacking supplies, but despite the lack of supplies, they were still able to inflict heavy damage to the incoming Soviets and incoming Americans, British, and French. Another constant theme of the German warfare, aside from, you know, parts of the military not getting the resources that they needed to wage the war that they wanted to wage, but also that the other theme being that despite not getting those resources, they were still a formidable fighting force and were able to do quite a lot with what they had available to them. And it kind of shows that kind of lucky that the Germans did not have the land or supplies available to them to wage the to properly supply all parts of their military. Because if they had, we might be seeing a different world. So that was the Kriegsmarine, Unsupported and Left to Die by Potential History. I hope you guys enjoyed. Remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more. And I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.